Here we go. All right, bud.
Alright. So, my name is Wittwer, and my passion is World War II. So, I'm just going to do the video ad first.
World War II. Has there been a more monumental conflict? Throughout history, there's been many important events. Perhaps none as important, or that have left as long of a lasting impact as World War II.
Next slide. So, I'm just going to start with my essential question, and it was, how did World War II shape the modern day? And essentially how I answered that was through the use of atomic and nuclear weapons for the first time, which directly led to the Cold War, which escalated tensions with Russia and led to things like the Great Space Race and the nuclear arms race. Out of World War II also came the United Nations, and there was drastic population changes all around the world, from either death tolls in the countries hit hardest by the war, or in things like the baby boom in the United States that we're still feeling the impacts today. Next slide. So just to kind of set the scene, there was two major sides, as most of you know, that you've learned throughout your history education, but there's the Axis and the Allies. The Axis was largely comprised of just Italy, Nazi Germany, and Imperial Japan, and this alliance was first created through the Tripartite Pact in 1940. On the Allies, there was many more countries than the ones listed up here, but the major players were going to be the United States, the United Kingdom, China, and the Soviet Union. Keep in mind that at the beginning of the war, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union were allies, and they invaded Poland together, but later Hitler, through Operation Barbarossa, betrayed the Soviet Union and invaded them, and that ended up being one of his biggest mistakes. So as to why I picked World War II for my passion, it's always just been one of my big personal interests. And there's so many movies and stories about World War II in the topic because it is so important. And so that kind of sparked me to want to learn more about World War II. I've also just really enjoyed history, and all of my favorite classes and subjects throughout my education have been history classes. And so, yeah, that was pretty much my reasoning for picking this as my passion. The major theaters in the war, and by theater I just mean locations in which the war was present, are going to be the Pacific Theater, which was largely between the United States and Japan and China. And then the European/North African Theater, where, as you know, probably the most famous portions of the conflict took place. Next slide. So I was going to do a brief summary or overview of the war. So it all starts with Hitler invading Poland on September 1st, 1939, and Britain and France declared war 2 days later. In 1940, there are sweeping changes throughout the continent of Europe as Germany overtakes France in a matter of weeks, which is crazy considering France's army size and how important they were during World War I. This is largely because France was expecting them to attack along their eastern front and not go through the Ardennes forest, but Germany did exactly that, and the France were essentially flanked and were taken over in a matter of weeks. Winston Churchill became Prime Minister of Britain, and then one of the earliest, I would say, small victories for Britain in the war, which there wasn't a lot for Britain, was the evacuation from Dunkirk, which, as many of you know, there was a movie on. And essentially, they had a lot of soldiers in France that were there to help the French repel the Germans, but as you know, that failed. And so, luckily, through a miracle, they got a lot of them out, even though they weren't expected to do so. Britain had an early victory against Germany in the Battle of Britain, where it was Germany's first attempt to kind of invade, but they were repelled. In 1941, which this is probably Hitler's biggest mistake, was Operation Barbarossa, and Hitler violated the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which is essentially just the agreement between Russia and Germany that they were going to be fighting together. Hitler's whole goal was to take Russia really quickly, that way he wouldn't be fighting on two fronts, but unfortunately his attacks stalled, and because of that he was fighting on two fronts, which would eventually lead to the downfall of Nazi Germany. Japan attacking Pearl Harbor, I like to call it like the big oopsie, because that was definitely not a good decision for them. They were overtaking China pretty quickly, and I think their goal was to kind of break the U.S. before they even entered the war, because keep in mind the United States is not in the war at this moment. But they decided to attack Pearl Harbor, and it essentially just succeeded in angering America, and then America declared war, and Japan was fighting on two fronts, much like Germany, which also led to their downfall. In 1941, Germany was also planning the final solution. Part of this they knew is because the chances of them winning weren't looking so good, and the final solution was essentially the extermination of the Jews within their territories, which, I mean, we're reading about Man's Search for Meaning right now, so I think many of you know the horrors of the concentration camps and what they had to go through. In 1942, Germany continues to suffer setbacks from the Russian campaign, largely due to the climate. Many of their soldiers weren't prepared for the harsh winters within Russia, and their supply lines were beginning to become stretched, and it was just becoming a mess. USA emerged victorious from the Battle of Midway in 1942, which was huge in the Pacific theater, because it was one of their first huge victories against Japan in the naval battle. And after that, Japan's navy was crippled and essentially wasn't going to be able to put up a fighting chance again. The final solution was implemented at Auschwitz in 1942 as well, which also is talked about in Man's Search for Meaning, as he was in Auschwitz for the early sections. In 1943, surrender at Stalingrad marked Germany's first major defeat. That was a huge deal, as there was a long siege at Stalingrad, and the Russian people within Stalingrad were starving, and they began, there's stories about them eating each other essentially, because they didn't have any food left. But Germany also was suffering from a lack of supplies, and that eventually led to their loss. The Allied victory in North Africa enabled the invasion of Italy to be launched. Italy was essentially tasked with just invading North Africa, which their army wasn't the strongest, and the British forces that were there with the French resistance forces were able to repel them. Italy surrenders, but Germany decides to take over the battle on their front as well, so now they're essentially fighting on three fronts. And then the British and Indian forces fight the Japanese in Burma and are victorious. In 1944, the Allies landed on Zion-Bal Monastery at Monte Cassino in Italy. The Soviet offensive gathers pace in Eastern Europe, and the Soviet Union starts gaining ground on Germany. D-Day was in 1944, which is the Allied invasion of France, as many of you know. It's the landings at Sword, Juneau, Gold, Omaha, and Utah beaches. Paris is liberated very quickly in August. Guam is liberated by the U.S. Okinawa from Japan, and Iwo Jima is bombed. In 1945, the war is starting to conclude. Auschwitz is liberated by the Soviet Union. The Russians reach Berlin, as well as the U.S. There was actually kind of a race between the U.S. and Russia to see who could reach Berlin first and essentially plunder it and try to get to the supplies first. Truman becomes president of the United States after Roosevelt's death, and Attlee replaces Churchill. Atomic bombs are dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Japan surrenders shortly after. Here's my video demonstration of my D-Day.
No, it's fake.
You are about to embark on the Great Crusade, towards which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. I have full confidence in your courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, June 6, 1944. D-Day, also known as Operation Overlord, is one of the most infamous days in all of recorded history. There are a few moments throughout
Sorry, I'm trying to make it big.
Bottom right hand corner.
It's not popping up though.
Oh, I thought it was. When you press play, I think it.
There you go.
Yeah, I.
June 6th, 1944. D-Day, also known as Operation Overlord, is one of the most infamous days in all of recorded history. There are a few moments throughout time where the whole world seems to stand still and all eyes turn towards one event. We've all heard the stories and seen the movies, but all those really attempted doing is give us a glimpse of what it must have been like to be on the beach that fateful day. D-Day was more than just a culmination of the events that took place in one single day, but rather many months of preparation and planning. The Allies had been considering a cross-channel invasion of occupied France for a while, but were still deciding on a location. Hitler knew this and tasked Erwin Rommel with finishing the Atlantic Wall. This was a 2,400-mile fortification of bunkers, landmines, beach, and water obstacles along France's northern coastline. However, the Allies had one small advantage. The Germans had no idea where along this coastline they would be attacking from. The Allies made it seem as if their main invasion target was the Pas-de-Calais, the northern point between Britain and France. Perhaps what was the greatest senior prank of all time, the Allies set up an entire phantom army made out of balloons and wooden objects, accompanied with radio transmissions that were giving out orders 24/7. The true location of the invasion happened to be Normandy. Britain and Canadian forces landed at Juno, Sword, and Gold Beaches, while the Americans took Omaha and Utah Beach. There was relatively light opposition that was met along Utah, Gold, Sword, and Juno, but this was not the case for Omaha Beach. U.S. forces faced heavy resistance at Omaha Beach, where there were over 2,000 American casualties. However, by day's end, approximately 156,000 Allied troops had successfully stormed Normandy's beaches. According to some estimates, more than 4,000 Allied troops lost their lives in the D-Day invasion, with thousands more wounded or missing. The D-Day invasion wasn't solely just the amphibious assault. There was also an airborne assault happening almost simultaneously, yet took place a little before. American airborne paratroopers, as well as British, had three main objectives to accomplish after being dropped in behind enemy German lines. The first was to seize the causeways connecting the beach to the inland. The second was to seize key points and relevant locations of area. And the third was to control the bridges over two key rivers. They were also tasked with destroying key points and artillery along the way, as well as making the transition for the troops from the beaches to the inland as easy and as smooth as possible. Omaha Beach is where the brunt of the heavy fighting took place, and is where the opening scene in Saving Private Ryan takes place as well. The reason this beach had such a high casualty count is because the Germans had machine guns lining the entire length of the beach in fortified positions. Because of this, as soon as the American troops' landing craft bay doors opened, they were immediately torn apart and had a hard time with their heavy equipment getting up onto the beach in positions where they would finally have cover. A cemetery is located off a bluff overlooking Omaha Beach that contains the remains of 9,387 American military. Not all of these soldiers were killed on Omaha Beach, as many were killed in ensuing military operations throughout World War II. You can still visit these graves today and pay respects to our fallen heroes who gave their lives for our freedoms.
So what makes World War II different from other wars, such as World War I? Personally, I think, as a lot of wars do, they bring out the best and the worst in humanity. I mean, as clearly can be seen with events like the Holocaust, obviously, but you also have stories like in Hacksaw Ridge, where somebody who decides to be a medic won't even use a weapon because they don't want to hurt anybody in the war. It was also the largest global conflict with over 80 countries being involved. Obviously, the main ones, there was only a few, but a lot of other countries took part in the war as well. Next. One of the most interesting things in the war, and most of the moral and ethical conflicts, come from the various atrocities that are associated with World War II. For example, as all of you know, the Holocaust, where over 6 million Jews and political opponents of Adolf Hitler were killed in concentration camps. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where in Hiroshima alone there was over 90,000 to 140,000 Japanese citizens and military personnel killed. In Nagasaki, where there was around 40 to 80,000. Dresden as well, which is not as well known, but was a German city that was firebombed by British forces, where there was over 40,000 people killed, and there was not much left of the city remaining after the bombings. The Nuremberg trials were not an atrocity in themselves, but they were directly relating to atrocities, as after the war, judges from the Soviet Union, the UK, and US were charging various Nazi officers and people convicted of war crimes after the war. There's a lot of criticism over these trials, though. Not so much over the Nazis' indictments and charges, but over the other war crimes, as the US was committing a lot of the same war crimes as the people they were charging, yet none of the Allies were actually being charged. It was just the losers. So some kind of dubbed it as victor's justice, where they decide the punishments after and kind of rewrite the history books. And then, as many of you know, Germany was split up among the victors, and is what led to like the Cold War and the Berlin Wall and the ensuing events after that. Other atrocities are like the gulags in the Soviet Union, which some suggest probably killed more than the concentration camps act, likely, but it's hard to know because there wasn't a lot of records kept. The rape of Nanking is where Japanese soldiers invaded China, and they were just killing all these civilians and slaughtering them. And then in the local newspapers back in Japan, they were keeping head counts to see who could kill the most, and it was just a really gross and disgusting event, in which a lot of awful things happened. And then, as you know, like Pearl Harbor, where Japanese attacked the U.S. naval base located in Hawaii. There's many more, but I only have time to talk about a few. As far as death tolls go, this one is by the fraction of various countries' population that died in World War II compared to like their total population. So by far, the Soviet Union suffered the most, with 26,600,000. This is including military and civilians. It's not just one or the other. China also suffered the second most with 20 million. Germany had 9 million. The majority of the people in the conflict died in between that conflict between Germany and the Soviet Union. As you can see, the Allies' casualties were relatively low, with the United States only suffering 420,000, the UK suffering 450,000. France suffered probably the most, with 550,000, and then, the Soviet Union suffered the most, but the rest of the Allies did not suffer that many casualties as compared to the Soviet Union, Germany, Japan, and China. Part of the reason this war is separated from the others is we have so many famous historical figures that are associated with it, such as Hitler, Stalin, and FDR. As you know, Hitler is one of the most evil men throughout history, as well as Stalin. There are a lot of debates where there's scholars on both sides talking about who probably killed more. Most scholars agree that it was most likely Stalin, actually, due to his gulags, and a lot of his own citizens died due to his policies. Both ruled through fear within their own regimes, Stalin's being a communist and Hitler's being a fascist. An interesting story about Stalin is when he died, actually, I think it was from a heart attack or something like that, but his guards were so afraid of him that they heard him fall, but they didn't want to go check on him in fear that it might anger him, because they didn't actually know what happened, so they stood outside of the doors for like a couple hours, and he passed away long before anybody entered. And then FDR, as you know, is one of the most famous presidents in American history. led us through much of World War II until he passed away, and then Truman took the helm and dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Other famous personalities in the war are obviously like Winston Churchill for the UK, who is probably one of the best wartime leaders that's ever been throughout history. He offered hope to the British people and inspired a lot of them to continue during their hard times. The UK really took a pounding in the early stages of the war, and Winston Churchill was instrumental in keeping the people's morale up. Benito Mussolini was another evil dictator, similar to Hitler or Stalin. He always wanted to be probably considered to be as instrumental in the war effort as them, but really his army wasn't as weak, or wasn't as strong as the other armies in the Axis. And then Hideki Tojo was the prime minister and general of Japan during World War II, who orchestrated the Pearl Harbor attacks, and many more. So what to take away from this? I think one of the important things to take away from all conflicts and events throughout history is you really need to be careful about looking at all the facts and information. Especially with this war, it's really easy just to see it as good versus evil, because many of the countries within the Axis were so evil, such as the Nazis and the Holocaust. It's probably one of the worst events that's ever transpired in history. But you have to be careful, because the Allies were not free to blame themselves and committed many atrocities on their own side, even though they may not have been charged for them since they won, and therefore they kind of decide who gets the punishment and who doesn't. But history is really important, and looking at the past can help us kind of to see where we're going in the future and stop us from repeating events like the Holocaust. So I think it's important we're knowledgeable about those and we talk about those, even though they are very awful. And yeah, I think history is just one of those things that everybody can take an interest in, whether it's more like history of like pop culture, or maybe it's history of world events like this. But I think it's important everybody finds their passion through that as well. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. What fascinates you the most about the whole World War II? What sparks your interest?
There's a lot of things. I think D-Day definitely